I have a video here of Michael Parenti talking about the revolution in Cuba and why he supports the revolution. So let's play the video and then we'll come back and talk about it.
You could look at any existing socialist country. If you don't want to call them socialist, call them whatever you want. Post-capitalist, whatever. I don't care. Call them camels, window shades. Doesn't matter. As long as we know the countries we're talking about. You can look at any one of those countries and you can evaluate them in several ways. One, comparing them to what they had before. And that to me is what's very compelling. That's what's so compelling about Cuba, for instance. When I was in Cuba, I was up in the Escambray, which is like the Appalachia of Cuba, very rugged mountains, people very poor they were. And I said to this campesino, I said, "Do you like Fidel?" And he said, "Sí, sí, with all our souls." I remember his gesture, with all our souls. I said, "Why?" And he pointed to this clinic right up there on the hill, which we had visited. He said, "Look at that." He said, "Before the revolution, we never saw a doctor. If someone was seriously ill, it would take 20 people to carry that person, because you'd go day and night. It would take 2 days to get to the hospital. First, because it was far away, and second, because you couldn't go straight. You couldn't cross the latifundio lands. The boss would kill you, so you had to go like this. And often when we got to the hospital, the person might be dead by the time we got there. Now we have this clinic up here with a full-time doctor. And today, a doctor in Cuba, when you become a doctor, you've got to spend 2 years out in the country. That's your dedication to the people. And a dentist who comes 1 day a week. And for more serious things, we're not more than 20 minutes away from a larger hospital. That's in the Escambray. He said, "That's freedom. We're freer today. We have more life." And I talked to a guy in Havana who says to me, "Before, all I used to see here in Havana, you call this drab and dull. We see it as a cleaner city. It's true, you got the paint is peeling off the walls, but you don't see kids begging in the streets anymore, and you don't see prostitutes. All we used to have was prostitutes. Prostitution used to be one of the biggest industries. And today, this man is going to night school. He said, I can read. I can read. Do you know what it means to be able to read? Do you know what it means to be able not to read?" I remember when I gave my book to my father, I dedicated a book of mine, Power and the Powerless, to my father. I said, "To my father with my love." Gave him a copy of the book. He opened it up, looked at that. He'd only gone to the 7th grade. He was a son of an immigrant, a working class Italian. And he opens the book and he starts looking through it and he gets misty-eyed, very misty-eyed. And I thought it was because he was so touched that his son had dedicated a book to him. That wasn't the reason. He looks up to me and says, "I can't read this, kid." I said, "That's okay, Dad. Neither can the students. I mean, that's not something. I mean, don't worry about that. I wrote it for you. I mean, it's your book, and you don't have to read it. You know, it's a very complicated book, an academic book." He says, "Yeah, I can't read this book." And the defeat that man felt. That's what illiteracy is about. That's what the joy of literacy programs is. That's why in Nicaragua you got people walking proud now for the first time. They were animals before. They weren't allowed to read. They weren't taught to read. So you compare a country to what it came from, with all its imperfections, and those who demand instant perfection. The day after the revolution, they get up and say, "Are there civil liberties for the fascists? Are they going to be allowed to have their newspapers and their radio program? Are they going to be able to keep all their farms?" The passion that some of our liberals feel the day after the revolution, the passion and concern they feel for the fascists, the civil rights and civil liberties of those fascists who were dumping and destroying and murdering people before. Now the revolution has got to be perfect. It's got to be flawless. Well, that isn't my criteria. My criteria is what happens to those people who couldn't read. What happens to those babies that couldn't eat, that died of hunger? And that's why I support revolution. The revolution that feeds the children gets my support. Not blindly, not unqualifiedly. And the Reaganite government that tries to stop that kind of process, that tries to keep those people in poverty and illiteracy and hunger, that gets my undiluted animosity and opposition.
Wow, I mean, what an incredible clip there from Parenti. What a relevant clip. And one in an internet era where anybody who talks about the Soviet Union, who talks about Cuba, who talks about China, who talks about existing socialist states, countries that have had revolutions and have tried to move towards socialism. Anybody who defends those in any way is labeled a tanky online now. People won't even make arguments against you. They'll just say tanky, tanky, tanky. But listen to Parenti here, all right? He's not saying he uncritically supports the Cuban Revolution. Towards the end, he says that he says you don't unabashedly support the revolution, but the revolution that feeds the people gets your critical support, right? He's not arguing that Fidel didn't make any mistakes and the Cuban Revolution was this flawless thing. What he's arguing is that under capitalism, there were and under colonization, there were places in Cuba that had no hope of ever having a doctor's office built there, right? Capitalism simply had no incentive to go to the poorest areas of Cuba and build doctor's offices. After the revolution happened, though, and the economy, and they tried to focus their economy on human beings rather than on making the maximum amount of profit for multinational corporations, they were able to put doctors' offices up in places that had never had doctors before. And what that means to the people. And you hear Parenti give that really powerful story about his father, and what illiteracy means to people, right? What these reading programs that were done by the Sandinistas in Nicaragua or the revolution in Cuba, what it means to someone to teach them to read, right? The power that you have from that knowledge, from being able to read books and understand arguments, and the fact that illiteracy was slashed in Cuba by the revolution. I mean, the idea, there's still, I saw Jake Tapper making this argument the other day that pre-revolution Cuba was better. Pre-revolution Cuba was run by the Fulgencio Batista military dictatorship. Cuba only had two crops, sugar and tobacco, which were exported to the U.S. for essentially slave labor on plantations for extremely cheap prices. And the people were starving. The people didn't have doctor's offices. Post-revolution, all that changed. And the people who fled, who had their assets seized by the government, by the revolution and given towards the people, those are the people who fled to America, right? Those are the gusanos, we call them, the Miami Cubans. The people who argue that the revolution was horrible. Fidel was horrible. Che was a mass murderer. He killed my family. He took my family's land, but they never mentioned that their family owned slaves and that the Fulgencio Batista military regime was executing 5 and 9-year-olds for terrorism, for speaking about left-wing ideals, right? And which brings us to another point that Parenti makes. It's always so there's a revolution. The U.S. puts an embargo on the country that does the revolution, blocking them off from trade with the rest of the world, as they've done with Cuba, Venezuela, Vietnam, China, every country who's had a socialist revolution. And then the country struggles because of the embargo. And we go, look, socialism fails every time it's tried. We told you socialism never works. And they compare the rich U.S., which has been exploiting the entire global South for the better part of a century, or for 60 to 80 years. And we say, look how much richer we are than these socialist countries, right? We compare ourselves to them. But we never compare countries like Cuba to what they were before the revolution, right? Before the revolution, Cuba was a slave state to the U.S., run by a military dictatorship. Now Cuba is a functioning country. They still struggle with the economic embargo, and after their main trading partner was the Soviet Union, so they struggled even more after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, but that hasn't stopped them from teaching their people to read. That hasn't stopped Cuba from creating more doctors than any other country in the world, which during the COVID pandemic has allowed them to export doctors to capitalist, much more wealthy capitalist countries who don't create nearly as many doctors because their systems function entirely different than revolutionary Cuba's. So Parenti says the government that feeds the children, that teaches the children, gets my support, and the Reaganite government who sends the CIA into Cuba, who sends the CIA or the military or whoever else, or launches economic embargo against every socialist country, they get his unabashed retribution. I don't know, whatever he says. He refutes them. And of course, that's still what we see today, right? We're crushing Venezuela with sanctions, sanctioning their oil industry, which goes to fund their social programs, which help the working class of Venezuela. We block them off from the rest of the world with economic embargo, and then we go, oh, socialism failed every time. Despite the fact that when the PDVSA, the Venezuelan oil company, was renationalized by Hugo Chavez and a series of social programs were launched, illiteracy was cut in half, poverty was cut in half, extreme poverty was reduced, a huge laundry list of all these accomplishments that were made for the regular working class Venezuelans. And we act like socialism's failed every time because Venezuela, under economic embargo, is more poor, has a lower GDP than the United States. It's like, no, the United States' GDP is so high because we're extracting wealth from the global south. And if you compare these places where they had revolutions to pre-revolution, they're doing much better. Basically in every case, obviously we know a lot went wrong in the Soviet Union. There was a lot of repression, but they were able to industrialize in a matter of 20 years. They went from an agrarian feudal society to the world superpower who defeated the Nazis in a matter of years using central planning. Same with China. China, obviously, we have, every socialist has their issues with the Chinese Communist Party or whatever, and they don't agree with all the actions we've done. We don't offer them uncritical support. Okay, any support you offer is critical, but they've brought 850 million people out of poverty. Okay, and you cannot deny that is not a good thing. That changes the material reality for 850 million people, taking them from a life of poverty and moving them into, a better life. And to act like China has made no accomplishments or that central planning and socialism has failed is ridiculous. And you're not comparing these countries to what they looked like prior to revolution. And even in the case of China now, they're threatening the US as far as GDP and other things too, right? So I'm making this point that you have to compare countries to to themselves pre-revolution versus post-revolution. But with China, it's getting to the point where you can compare them to the US, right? They're becoming the most powerful country on the planet, using central planning and using socialism. And then my favorite part of this lecture is Parenti mocking the liberals. The passion some of these liberals feel for the fascists the day after the revolution. Are you going to let them have their newspapers? So funny. It's so true because Americans have so much sympathy for the gusanos. Like I said, the people who had their slaves or whatever taken by the revolution who fled to America. Prior to the revolution, they were murdering people. They were repressing people. They were beating people. They were using slave labor to enrich themselves by sending crops to the U.S. at dirt cheap prices, right? And these are the people who the revolution defeated. And these people fought tooth and nail to keep their capital, to defeat the revolution. They murdered members of the revolution. They tortured them. They imprisoned them. And I'm not saying the revolution didn't do the same back, right? They fought in a war. Think of the American Civil War. There were casualties on both sides. You wouldn't call the Union soldiers evil, murderous dictators because they threw Confederate soldiers or took prisoners of war from the Confederacy, right? It was warfare. It was civil war. It was one group fighting with tooth and nail to hold on to their slaves and their plantations and their capital. And then it was the slaves and the workers fighting to change Cuba into something better, which is what they've done. And the liberals in the U.S. go, oh, but Fidel and Che killed people. Everything they've done is awful. They said things that weren't totally politically correct in 1959. Therefore, we should disavow everything they've done for Cuba, disavow all the schools they've built, disavow all the hospitals they've built. Everything about Cuba is bad, which is a completely undialectical approach, right? And this is an approach you see people, even Marxists, taking, right? Every single socialism's never worked before. It's all bad, but trust us, we're going to do it right this time. No, socialism has had its successes and it's had its failures, and Cuba's a perfect example of that. And it's good to recognize that and recognize what they did well, recognize what they did wrong, and take the good with the bad, But what the liberals do is they show, so much passion for the gusanos, right? My family's friend lived in Cuba and he had his plantation taken by the government. Isn't that awful? That's such big government. Yeah, well, your buddy's plantation in Cuba was also exploiting slaves and leading Cuba into poverty, while the bourgeoisie in Cuba became extremely wealthy by using slave labor to import or sell resources to the United States or to the West. So that's my thoughts on revolution there and how we should support existing socialist states. And I think Michael Parenti summed it up really well. It's not like we can't criticize Che and Fidel. There are plenty of criticisms, and Cuba is honestly one of the better examples of existing socialist states. Like there was much more repression that went on with the Cultural Revolution in China, or with the kind of the Stasi in East Germany, or the purges in the Soviet Union, the gulags. These are obviously things we disavow. but Cuba has a very, very good record. Fidel was anti-gay marriage at first, which is, one of the main things people critique him on. But actually, he changed his position on that. Cuba became one of the first countries in the world to legalize gay marriage. Fidel apologized for everything he said, and now the Cuban government pays for transition facilities for people suffering from, or people who experience gender dysphoria. So to act like they're not progressive is almost laughable. Whereas the Soviet Union never legalized gay marriage, as far as I know. Russia today still remains, pretty bigoted towards the LGBTQ plus community, whereas Cuba does not. But so as I'm saying, people try and look at these things as a monolith, right? Socialist countries were bad or socialist countries were good, and you got to pick one side and defend the other. But that's not what dialectical materialism is. The dialectical approach is to take the good with the bad. You can support something while still criticizing something, and that's what we need to do with existing socialist states and with socialist states who failed in the past, like the Soviet Union. So I hope you guys liked that Parenti video. It's one of my favorite videos of all time. I felt like I wanted to share it. I want to do more videos like this where I just play a short clip and react to it, kind of like Kyle Kalinske does over at Secular Talk, if any of you watch that show. But he reacts to things in the news usually. I would like to react to lectures and more academic style stuff. So let me know if you like this style of video. Thank you for watching. Peace out.